Go.
Welcome to the fifth production of Tuesday, June 9th, 2020 of the Global Hope Conference. We're here to introduce Dr. Christopher Smithmyer. He is the Vice President of International Affairs at Brave Online Conflict Management. Find them at www.brave.org. No E. And he is one of the most educated men in the world, and he's here today to tell us about the failures of fiat currency and transitioning to something better. Dr. Smithmyer, please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Remy. So as Remy said, my name is Dr. Chris Smithmyer. I'm here in the United States. I'm up in Pennsylvania. And today I'm going to get a chance to talk to you guys about fiat currency and some of the problems that we're facing in the global economic picture because of the fiat currency. So before I get into that, I want to tell you a little bit about myself and why I'm speaking on this topic. As Remy said, I have a lot of degrees. I'm a letter collector. I have a lot of letters after my name. And one of the biggest focuses that I've had as I've been going through and working on my education is the confluence of business and law, especially around international business. And as I've been studying this, as I've been looking at the way economics interlace to create this fabric of success or failure around the world, I've learned that one of the biggest dangers is the fiat currency system. And as I've been studying, as I got my MBA and an LLM in international business and a law degree in business law, you learn that the currencies are basically valuable because of what people say they're worth. So the reason for this speech is we are at a very unique time in the world. We're just coming off of the COVID crisis. We're just coming off of this global tragedy that has really weakened the world economy. Now, the stock markets are still trading up from where they were 3.5 years ago, but we're still in a very dangerous position because a lot of businesses are suffering. A lot of businesses are running off of money that the government's given them. And this money from around the world has been borrowed from other governments or just printed as it was needed. And as we go into this time, whenever we're going to start coming out of this fear, we've already seen people that they're less afraid of going out in public because they're rallying in this global unity about ending racism. And they're coming together. And as these economies are starting to build back up, we're going to have to work with the realization of the borrowed money and the new printed money and how we deal with it. And I wanted to talk about this a little bit here at the Global Hope Conference because part of the hope of the future is that we can have better monetary policy that helps bring people closer together and still preserves the free market. And those are really hard concepts to knit together, but when you do knit them together, they create a really beautiful tapestry of how the economy can be in the future. So, as Dr. Elise said, I am the Vice President of International Affairs at Brave. Brave is an international conflict management consortium that has a digital platform for providing ADR, ODR, and conflict management methodologies to people around the world. And it also provides access to justice and training for people in countries around the world that normally don't have access to this because of their distance or because of prices in their home countries. And I hope that you'll check out our webpage at www.brab.org and look at some of the products and services that we offer. But now we're going to get into what you want to hear me talk about. We're going to talk about fiat currency and why it's problematic and how we can make things a little bit better. So the first thing, anytime I talk about currency, that I like to bring up for people is the history of money. Money is such an interesting concept whenever you get down to it because it is these little pieces of paper and little pieces of metal that have very little intrinsic value, but the whole world agrees that they're one of the most important things out there. And whenever you start to look at the history of money, you really start to look at why people are so fascinated with it and why we give it so much value. So we're going to start off with where did currency and trade and barter start off with? And barter is the most basic system. We still do it, but now we do it with money instead of goods. But when the system started out, we started out with two types of things. And these are the core principles of property law. We started out with real property, which is the land, the physical land that things grow on. And we started out with personal property, which is the stuff we have. Your car, your watches, your food, all your stuff, that's personal property. And for this lecture, we're not going to talk about the land very much because that really wasn't where currency started. You can't just pick up somebody's land and leave with it. But you have stuff. And whenever I trade you my stuff for your stuff, we have a system, and that's called a barter system. I can give you a chicken for a goat. You can give me a sheep for a shovel. Whatever the trade is, it's one person giving the other person something that they value less for something they value more. And it's the simplest form of contract, and it's very important. And we've got to imagine that people have been trading since as soon as we evolved into human beings. Probably Cro-Magnon man was trading, and they had these trade systems. Now, as trade becomes more important in a society, we find that people start to collect more stuff than they need. And this is where people start having things, and they only have so much room in their house or their palace or whatever they have. So we had to have some representation of value that we need to look at so we could see how much money we actually have. And since money was a new concept, what were we going to use? And this is where it gets really interesting, because we picked gold as a species all around the world. Gold was relatively valuable. And a lot of people have speculated why it was valuable. One reason is that it's heavy. So if you traded stuff and you had gold, you had a whole pile of gold in your house, it was really hard for somebody to come in and steal all of your gold. Imagine you're back, we're living in mud huts in the world. We haven't domesticated horses or cows. We have no animals to ride. Our weaving skills are really bad. And we come, and I'm a robber, and I come to your house, and I'm going to take your gold. And when I get in there, you have these piles of gold, and they're not ingots. They're not like we think of whenever we think of gold, but they're actually just these rocks that have gold in them. Or they might even be little splatters of gold or primitive coins. And I can only put so much of that in the bag. It's bad weaving. It's like getting a bag at Walmart, where whatever you put in the bag is going to fall out the bottom. So gold, that's one of the reasons that scholars think that gold might have been such a good item to use as the initial currency, because it was hard to steal a whole bunch of it at once because it's heavy, and you couldn't really put it in a bag and just run off with it because it would fall out the bottom of the bag. Another reason that people thought that gold was a good metal for currency is because it really, for primitive people, wasn't very useful for anything. Now, in the modern world, we have gold everywhere. We have gold right here on the chips of our computers, and this is what makes electricity much more efficient. But back then, gold really wasn't good for a whole lot. We didn't really have a lot of jewelry back in the day. They might have had the gold rings that they had in their noses that people talk about in the Bible, but gold, it didn't have a whole lot of value. You couldn't make tools out of it. You couldn't make pots and pans out of it. It melted to too low of a temperature, and it wasn't hard enough for any real use. So you had this metal that was there, and we didn't really have a use for it. So that's another reason that some scholars believe gold was chosen. Another reason that scholars believe gold was chosen was because it's pretty. For anybody that's held a piece of gold or a gold nugget or found a gold flake in a river, you know that it has that mesmerizing look to it that really draws you into it. And a lot of people thought that may be the value that they saw for gold. So for about 2,000 to 3,000 years of known history, we had where gold was king. That was what we had for trading and bartering whenever you moved beyond the goats and the sheep and the carts and all the stuff that we were trading. After that, we had what were called banknotes or letters of credit. Now, this was a group of people got together and said, okay, we'd like to start doing international trade. And this is where things became really important, because nobody really wanted to ship large amounts of gold from one country to another. You didn't want to put gold on a boat because it's heavy. If there was a storm, if went to the bottom of the boat, your entire fortune's gone. You didn't want to put it on a cart because guess what? If you put it on a cart, that makes it easy to transport and somebody could steal it. So people were putting the gold in vaults, and these vaults were protected. So what would happen would be you'd have the first primitive versions of a bank where they would write a note. You have X numbers of bars of gold in your account. You are going to give this number of gold to whoever, Caesar, whoever you were giving the gold to. And they'd come to the bank, and if they wanted to get the gold, they could get their gold. If they didn't, they could just store it at the bank the same way you were storing the gold at the bank. Now, this was a very effective way for allowing this because the banks would talk to each other. And if you would ever take a class with me where I'm doing a class on bills of lading, you'd learn that this was the first thing of sea-bound travel because it allowed for things to be shipped around seas, and the banks would talk to each other, and it actually made things a lot safer for long-distance shipping. But that's a story for another time. So as these letter of credits became more complex, these banks, these institutions that were holding money, began issuing checks where you would have a note and you'd say, I need to know that I have 2 pounds of gold. Well, they'd write you a note that was valued at 2 pounds of gold, and you could take that to somebody that you were selling something to, and you could trade it. Now, it wasn't always gold. It could be gems. It could be whatever you were storing in your vault or in the vault in the area, and it would let people know that you were able to do that. Now, the huge problem with this, the huge problem with the whole banknotes, checks, notes of credit, those type of things was they only worked for the ultra rich. Now, back in those days, that might mean the person that owns a cow in the village or however things were set up. But it only worked for people that had a lot of money to use. So pretty soon, people that were rich realized that, hey, poor people have a bunch of stuff. Now, each individual poor person doesn't have a bunch of stuff, but poor people have stuff. They have land, they have food, they have these things that I want. But I can't trade them a letter of credit or a bank check because whenever they go to the bank to get it, the bank's not going to give it to them because they're poor. The bank's not going to give them that kind of stuff. So these global governments, and it appeared all over the world, and it's one of those things that seems to be ingrained in humanity, is this idea of currency. Like there was currency in China, in India, in Middle Eastern regions, in Europe. There were even some forms of currency in Africa and Australia that were not metal currencies, but they were still a form of currency because it facilitated trade with people with less money. Because instead of having to have a pound of gold to mean anything, you could have a small gold or a small silver or a small copper or a small bronze coin, which would allow you to trade. And it increased trading among the people that had less money. And whenever this happened, it enabled economies to really become something more than just the rich people taking food from the poor for protection. It allowed them to become economies of scale and economies where people were working together. So this allowed for merchants, for real bankers, for international trade. All of this came from those small coins that were developed. So fast forward another 1,000 years. Now we have people who are starting to get a lot of coins. Now they're having the same problem that they had with gold. I don't want to transport a large amount of gold with me. So what do I do? So they'd go to their bank, they'd put their money in their bank, and then the bank would issue them a bank check, a bank draft, or a check. Now this is a check with a CK, not a QUES. Now what this did is it was basically the same thing that was happening whenever banknotes were being issued before. Of course, they weren't called banknotes. They were more letters of credit back then. What this did was it allowed you to have a statement of money, and eventually this came into the form of paper money, which happened about 1,000, 1,500 years ago. We started actually getting widespread use of paper money. The Chinese had it a little bit before Western civilization did. Now, this allowed people to carry a lot more money with them. So it allowed them to have money, but whenever you have a lot of money with you, you still have the same problem that you had with having a lot of gold or you had with a lot of product, is somebody could rob you if you're going long distance. So people once again, we're going to fast forward about 1,000 years. Now we're into the 1920s. We're caught up. We're more into modern time now. And people started getting the idea that we need something to have credit. So basically, credit started out as this institution knew you. They knew that you'd pay off. So they would extend you credit. And then whenever you had your money, you came in and paid them. Nice and simple process. I mean, it still happens today. People still have bar tabs. I mean, it happens. So it was good, but this credit system still meant you had to carry a bunch of money with you if you wanted to go somewhere else where you were going to buy something from somebody you didn't really know well. And this became challenging because we got away from the handshake to needing something else. And that something else that we had was credit cards. Credit cards were an ability for you to go to a specific institution anywhere that institution was and use your card. They'd run it through the chop machine and it would tell them that, yes, you did. This would be the number, and then they'd bill you at the end of the month. As this evolved, as we moved into the digital age, we started to have these credit cards where not only did you have to go to a single institution to use them, like you can use them anywhere. So you've got your MasterCard, your American Express, your Visa, your Discover card, your Maestro, all of those different cards that now you could use. Now, as we moved up through the 1980s and 1990s, credit cards became more common, and people realized that credit cards were a really bad thing to have. Because as companies built credit cards and as companies built their business around credit cards, you started using your credit cards and they started charging you interest. They started expecting you not to pay up at the end of every month so that you could spend more interest. Then there was overdraft fees, or withdrawal fees, late payment fees. And people were starting to lose money off of that. So as it came to the turn of the millennium, people started turning towards debit cards. These are like credit cards, except for it's your money. You're not borrowing money from someone else and then paying it back. So debit cards were and are still very useful because they allow you to only use the money you have. Some of them even let you draw credit afterwards if you run out of money, but usually with exorbitant fees. So this was really effective because it was a digital currency. It allowed you to go anywhere in the world without having to carry money. So your traveler's checks, even currency exchanges started to become obsolete. Now we're moving into a new age where people are starting to use e-currency. And e-currency is basically a digital statement that you have the money in this digital currency and you can use it for something else. You got Bitcoin, you got Ethereum, those type of things. And what that does is it brings us to where we are in the modern day, where we've got 4 basic types of currency exchange that we're going to use. We've got money. We're still using money. We're still using that paper money, the coin money. We're still using it. We've still got credit cards. Even as bad as they are for people's financial well-being, we still have credit cards. We have debit cards, which are basically one of the safest things as long as somebody doesn't steal them, because if your bank's updated to credit cards like mine, all the numbers are on the back. I mean, all they need is a picture of the back of your card and you're in trouble. And then we have e-currency, which has shown its own problems, which is a story for another time, because we're going to more look at how currency works rather than the e-currency, because e-currency kind of is being treated like a stock now. So moving on, we're going to look at the mechanics of currency. So we have, in the United States, we have the dollar. In India, they have the rupee. In China, they have the yuan. In Japan, they have the yen. In Australia, they have the Australian dollar. The Caribbean dollar. The euro in Europe. The pound sterling in Britain. The ruble in Russia. We have money all over the world in different kinds. And the one thing that we have that tells us what they're worth are central banks. Now, most of these central banks are either operated with the state or operated in conjunction with the state. And they announce how much currency is being printed, how much currency is being destroyed, like the old tore up bills and old coins that are being phased out. And that sets the value of the currency. Now, normally that is fairly effective because the banks want to keep the currency well valued because they're controlling the money. This is how they make money, is off of money. So if the money becomes worthless, then their business becomes worthless. However, because inefficient governments are able to influence this, and governments are the biggest spenders of money in the world. I mean, that's not just hyperbole, they spend more money in the world than anything else, except for maybe the combined wealth of all the business in the world. But for individual actors, most governments are the biggest spenders in the world. And whenever they come to the bank and they say, well, we need more money or else we're going to go under, if they go under, the bank's money becomes worth less, and so the bank just prints more. Now, it devalues the currency, but not devaluing it as much as if the currency goes completely valueless because the country goes under. So we have we have this fiat currency system, which is just based on what we're being told the money is worth. And I mean, there are equations that go into it. There are a lot of things. I mean, it's based off the GDP and other things like that. And they don't just pull the number out of the air, but it is manipulable. And if they want to do what's called quantitative easing, which is a fancy word for printing more money, or quantitative restrictions, which is the fancy word for printing less money, the banks have control of that. And while most countries can overrule the bank if they have to, the banks still have control. The bank's interest is still profit. And the choices sometimes end up more towards profiting banks than they do production or service industries. So we started with this gold-based currency in 1913 in the United States anyway, and in other countries it was all about that same time. We moved on to the fiat currency, and now we're in a place where currency is being printed so quickly that we really don't have a way to control it. And that is very dangerous for us as a society, and it's something that we need to keep our eye on, and we need to look for something new. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So the first thing that people have been looking at, now if you go online and you look at end the Fed or get rid of fiat currency, the first thing people are going to say is, let's go back to a gold-based currency. Now, the reason that we don't want to do that, the reason that it doesn't make sense to do that, is because it's based on the idea that governments tell the truth all the time. And I think everybody knows it's kind of an insane notion anymore. Governments lie just like everybody else. And what happened when we had the gold-based currency was there was only so much gold. When a government needed to print more money, they said they had got more gold, and then people started finding out, hey, there's not as much gold as we thought there was. We see stock markets crash, we see international wars, we see people fighting over the gold, and it doesn't work because it's not a expandable type of currency that can move with the population. And as the world's population increases, we either have the situation where we have this gold-based currency where there's only so much money and it's divided among the people that live in the world, but it's not divided equally. And don't worry, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that money should be completely divided equally, because that's almost as insane as fiat currency. What does happen, though, is as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, there's no way to balance that out with new money. So as long as the rich hoard the money, there's no way to do that, short of war, of getting the money out of them. This isn't the best way to go, because the rich people, they're productive for a reason, because they're doing work that is useful or that people want. So as we move towards a new currency, we need to stay with the concept of producing markets so that people continue to do work and continue to make more goods for us to use. But we've also got to look at a new future where it's something that's based on something that can grow with the population. This is why today we're going to talk about labor-based currency. Now, the idea of labor-based currency has been around for a long time. One of the things that I was always worried about when giving this speech is that people associate it with socialism, and it's not necessarily a socialist model. Some of the models of labor-based currency are based off socialism, but most of them are simply based off of a production-based economy of what a country is producing. So at the end of the year, you figure out how much stuff the country made. That's what the total value of the currency is. You adjust the value of the currency via the banking system to either raise or lower the amount, which means this country has to keep cash reserves on hand. They can't just run a huge deficit. But what it does is it allows the country to get money. Now, the problem with this is that it only focuses on the physical production of the country. You don't look at what the service industry is, the banking industry, the stock markets, innovation, anything like that. It is physically what is produced in the country. Now, as more and more countries focus more on service industries as opposed to domestic production, this becomes dangerous because the world's superpowers, with the exception of China and India, would be plunged into depression, and China and India would probably make out pretty well on it until people realize that, hey, you don't want to make as much stuff in China because their currency is worth more. So then business would move out of China, it would move into the world. It would completely put the global economy in flux for a period of about 100 to 150 years is the estimates, not my estimates, somebody else's. And it would really put us basically into a dark age, and we're already kind of in one now. So someone else came up with the idea of a labor-based economy of what labor is producing. Now, this takes more into effect the other industries, the service industries, innovation, stock markets, banking, those type of industries. However, it's still a reactionary model. You don't know how much a country produced till the end of the year, which means at the end of the year, you're going to have speculators that have been watching numbers all year that have a pretty good idea, and they're going to be able to long or short the money on it and really create a crimp on the international market for specific currencies, because you know if they're going up or down, so you short the currency or long the currency to make more money off of it. Reactionary models are problematic because when you have a reactionary model, anybody that's good at doing that is going to be able to play the market on the model. And it really destabilizes the model because then the model isn't working within its traditional paradigms. It's working within the paradigms related to how people are trading the currency. So what I worked on, and I have a paper coming out with the Perona Foundation and their Lawful Talks journal, is a projection labor based currency. Now, what this currency would do would be targeting a 3-year, 2-year, 1-year, and current projection models for the ability of the country to produce in the coming year, which would mean that anybody would have access to the estimated values based on the 3, 2, and 1-year models, but the current year model would also allow for there to be some variability to adjust for changes within the model. Now, what this does is it allows the country to say, we are going to have X dollars worth of currency in circulation, and by having that X dollars worth of currency in circulation, we know how much our money is worth. And the reason that basing it off of the projections of the total amount of labor that is currently able to be produced by the country is that it's a reliable number, but it is a number that can move along with the population. As the population grows, the number can go up. As the population diminishes, it goes down. As more people move into higher paying jobs, the economy can go up. As people move into lower paying jobs, the amount of currency reduces, so the currency is worth more. It eliminates the need for these constant changes in minimum wage, and it also allows people to balance out wages across specific job titles so that everybody within it is making the same amount, because the individual year-to-year changes will overshadow the need for yearly raises and that type of thing, which kind of ends up creating an unequal situation between peers within companies. The great thing about a projection labor-based economy as compared to a production labor-based economy or a pure labor-based economy is that you're targeting expectations versus reality. With the older models, with the labor-based economy and the production-based labor economy, you were looking at something where if anybody could get their hands on last year's numbers, they could play the market. They could actually make fortunes off of bidding on whether the money was going up or down by buying another country's currency based on the same principles. With a expectation-based and a number-based economy, so you know what the people are there for, but you don't know the value that's going to be assigned to each person relative to the currency, it allows the country to set the currency with a little bit of, people know whether it's going up or down, but they won't know how much it's going up and down. So it becomes much harder to play the market, and it also becomes more likely that they'll keep the money in the current economy. They might buy a declining currency or something like that if they were trying to short something. But other than that, they would keep it within the economy, which would keep money home, which would help local economies and get rid of dangerous foreign investment within countries, which can bankrupt economies, as we're seeing in some of the California regions and some other places in the United States. Now, when there is a downward model, what it does is it adjusts the value of the currency and the amount of currency that's out for the next year, which can restrict the amount of currency, which increases the value of the currency within the domestic market. So basically, it increases the value of the low-income workers and decreases the value of the high-income workers for the year, so that the economy balances itself out towards production and away from service. In the upward model, what happens is the value of the currency decreases because more currency is put out there, which lowers the value of the lower income and increases the value of the service industry, which increases the amount of service done and decreases the amount of production done, which reverses the model and balances the model back out. So it is going to follow a Keynesian curve, but it's a more controlled Keynesian curve because it's reacting to the factors which adjust the curve. And eventually the models will get smaller and smaller. And as the education model adjusts to the training model, it will help with that also. For the first couple of years, it would be a very volatile market, but unlike switching to a pure production-based economy, which would take about 100 years to balance out, this would balance out in 2 to 3 years. And whenever you're estimating, the factors would be the hardest part, is getting the accurate estimations, the accurate census, and the accurate information on people's education, which would take a couple years to refine the system. And we could get away from a 10-year census more into like a 2 to 3 year census, because of we can do that digitally every year if people put their information. And it could actually be census data could be collected with the tax return data, and you could still keep it down to one sheet. So that does bring up a good point, that when you're stabilizing the currency, one of the best tools that the government has is to have a proper tax system. Now, right now, we have a system where the government is balancing the currency by simply adjusting the value of the currency, just saying this is what it's worth. And more people, as they learn about how currency works, realize that it's all a myth. Money being worth what they say money is worth is only worth it if everybody agrees. If I'm the only person in the world that's making Snicker bars and I want to sell Snicker bars for $5, not the 99 cents that they cost now, there's nothing to stop that. Now, someone else could come into the market, but it works to balance out the market whenever you're producing or whether you're offering a service. But when you're the only person or the only entity that is able to print money, it doesn't balance out. And quantitative easing or quantitative restrictions can really destroy an economy, especially one that is growing as fast as we have it growing now. So one of the most popular corrective taxation systems out there on the market today is the VAT tax, the VAT tax. It's value added tax, which is kind of crazy that they call it a VAT tax whenever the T's in there. It's kind of like an ATM machine. But a VAT tax punishes the domestic market for improvements on the economy. Basically what happens is if I get a mask I have a 8-track tape. If I was a company and I was putting the sticker on the 8-track tape, whatever value I added to the 8-track would be what would be taxed at my company. And only that would be taxed. So the imports wouldn't be taxed, only the added value. And while that sounds like a great idea to some people, if you look at it, it's only punishing the domestic market. It's not punishing the international market, which means that you can get cheap goods from other countries and then you punish your domestic market for any improvements they make on them, as opposed to trying to get as much tax from other countries as opposed to taxing your own people to death. This is kind of like having a governor on a race car where you can only go up to a certain speed, but other people don't have that restriction. So you're taking away power from the economy and giving everybody else a advantage that's unfair to you. So this is a really dangerous tax regime, and taxes should never be a tool to suppress the economy. They're simply a necessity that needs to work within the framework of the economy. And as we move into tax models like that, we see that we can help the economy, we can help control wage gaps and inequality in employment without really putting too much of the government's hand in and letting the hand of the free market actually work. So one of the most important things that we should look at whenever we're doing taxing is a tiered income tax. Now, there are a lot of people out there in the world that want to get rid of the income tax because there are major problems with the income tax, chief of them being that it's a punishment for people working. People that aren't working don't have to pay income tax because they don't have income. So it's kind of like punishment for workers, bonus for people that aren't working. The good thing about strong economies is that whenever you have a strong economy, you have a system where most people are working. And you need to have a welfare net. You need to have something to protect people. But you also cannot make that net so strong that people can go just live off the dole of the state. You can't have, it needs to be a balance, and it's balancing out welfare systems is a speech for another time. But one of the best ways to initiate a income tax to maintain incentive to work but diminish the wage gap is to have a tiered income tax. And you need to have a tiered income tax for both business and personal income tax. You can't run them both off of the same tax, which is why LLCs are such a great mechanism in the United States for setting up your company, because if you have an LLC, you can choose whether you want to be taxed as a business or whether you want to be taxed individually. So you can take your choice among the different tax regimes. So let's start off with the business taxes. What we would propose for this is a 3-level business tax based on how many people you employ. So if your company is making more than $1 billion, like if you're a $1 billion company, you are taxed at a flat rate of 16% minus 1% per 100,000 people you employ up to 600,000 people. Now, if you're employing that many people, you're putting tons of money back into the economy. And this is profit. This is not gross. This is your net income. You're not being taxed on your gross. So this allows for a major increase, and it's also much lower than the current tax regime that's in existence. Now, all of these would require government cutbacks on programs that are unnecessary, but it's one of the things that it would reduce the tax regime for these companies and bring more companies into the country, which more people giving a little is better than one person or one company giving a lot. The next tier would be for businesses that make between 10 million and 1 billion. These businesses would be taxed at a rate of 13%, less 1% per 10,000 people you employ. So for every 10,000 people, you get 1% off, down until you get to 8%. So you could get rid of 5% of your taxes if you employ 50,000 people. That's a pretty good deal, and it allows them to get their tax rate down to 8%. The final group is people that make less than $10 million in revenue a year, or companies that make less than $10 million in revenue a year. They would be taxed at 9% of the rate flat, minus 1% for every 1,000 people you employ up to 3,000 people. So they would have the lowest tax bracket of 6%, which is the same as the sales tax, and it would enable you to have this business, start small businesses, and move them forward by hiring more people and creating new jobs. What it does is we want an economy where everybody's working, so the more people that are working, the better. And if we give companies incentives for hiring people full-time, and all these numbers are for full-time employees, this does not count for part-time employees, you get these tax breaks. And these are the only tax breaks. There are, other than purchasing price items like that for write-offs for things that you've purchased in the production of good out of your gross economy, everything else is normally taxable. We're getting rid of the entire loophole structure. Now, moving on to the personal income tax. If you make less than $100,000 a year, you don't pay any income tax, and we completely eliminate the couples filing. So it's just one number. It's not one number for each spouse. Each spouse files independently. If you make between $100,000 and $250,000, you are taxed 10% on all monies over $100,000. If you make $250,000 to $500,000, you are taxed 20% for all monies over $250,000, and then it goes down. So it's the same way the income tax is set up now. You only pay the upper rate on the money over the rate that you're paying. It's 30% for people making 500K to a million, 45% for people making 1 million to 2.5 million, 60% for people making 2.5 to 5 million. So we're getting into the celebrity athletes range there. 75% for people making 5 to 10 million, and 90% of people making over $10 million a year. And if conservatives are screaming right now about this, this is actually 5% less on each of those levels than the original Reagan tax plan. In accompanying with this, because it is unfair that the people making only up to $100,000 don't pay any taxes, everybody pays an 8% sales tax across the board. Now, those numbers look big and scary. The 90%, the 75%, people are screaming, ripping their hair out, saying, why would we do that? Why would we want that? The tax code I just gave you are for personal and capital gains tax. Everything goes into a person's income. It's not separated out like it is now. And it would reduce the taxes of 99.3% of people in the United States. And it would. And it would just bring it down. And it would also help reduce the wage gaps within communities, because companies wouldn't want to pay people whenever they're going to pay most of it in taxes. So they lower that. They put money back into their company, money back into the community, money back into their employees, and it starts balancing out. We can quit debating about the minimum wage issue. While there will always be a minimum wage, there will always be a person that makes the least money in the world. More people will make more money based on this model because they won't be paying as much in tax to the government. Now, in addition to this, one of the items that helps keep the currency and stable is a deflation tax, where 2% or more, depending on the company, they could increase it up to as much 5% on every monetary transaction that happens during the course of the year would be put into a fund. Now, this fund has two purposes. First, it is to deflate the value of the currency and make it so the currency is actually worth more. It actually helps increase the value of your currency. Second is it is to attack the national debts that are plaguing this world. Part of our biggest economic problem in the world is the national debts. So for the first however many years it takes, let's say we're just going with a flat 2% sales tax on every monetary transaction, stocks, banks, buying food, whatever you're doing, a 2% tax. And that money would go directly into a fund that at the end of the year would be used to buy back bonds that are owned by other countries, which is how national debt works. And those bonds would then not be reissued, and the national debt would be decreased every year by that amount. Now, a lot of people look at that number and say, okay, well, we're going to take the GDP. Let's say a country has $1 trillion GDP, and 2% of that tax would be $20 billion. They'd be like, oh, that doesn't do a whole lot of good for this, but it's actually that each dollar of that $1 trillion goes through people's hands about 100 times. So instead of having $20 billion, you'd have approximately $200 billion. And that money would be used to pay off the bonds, not the interest on the bonds. That bond has to come out of the national budget, however the government was paying for it before. And as that money is being paid, whatever goes over is buying against the principal to bring the principal down. So the interest is lower next year. By recommendation, you'd keep paying the higher amount. But if you can't do that, then you just keep paying it down until the national debt is gone. And then you don't have the national debt and you don't have the interest of the national debt that is a major problem for the country. After the national debt is paid down, the next phase is to work with countries that are working to destroy their national debt in the same way, to buy their national debt from countries that are not working to do the same thing. Now, this goes in hand with the tariff regime to try to get countries around the world to get rid of national debt and try to get each country surviving on its own without the national debt. But when we get past paying off your own national debt, then you buy the national debt of other countries that are in the system, and you allow the countries that are in the system to pay you instead of pay the other country to pay off their national debt, which it's still national debt for the country that owes it. But instead of them paying, say the United States paying China, if Australia pays off their national debt before the United States would, Australia would then buy American national debt, and the United States would pay Australia to buy that national debt down. So Australia is making the money instead of a country that is exploiting other countries via currency manipulation. So there would be some international collaboration. Once the national debt of all partner nations or all nations that are within the partnerships for this are paid off, then that money would be destroyed at the end of the year after it was collected. Now, what that does is it increases the value of the currency. This would happen for about 10 years until the currency becomes stable, and then it would be done every couple years to stabilize the currency to keep the value at about the same level, which would be really bad for currency speculators, but for people that are living in the country, it would be very, very effective. And it would, within 15 years, we could see a stabilized global economy that could help developing nations become developed nations, and it would allow currently developed nations to keep strong economies as we look towards building bases on the moon and other stuff like that, that is expanding humanity's ability. And this approach also doesn't force us to go under like a one world government or allow the UN, which is one of the most inefficient organizations in the world and should be disbanded, to try to come in and run countries. It's just an insane idea. So in conclusion, good international currency is very important. And we need currencies around the world that are strong, not just our currency, but we need other currencies to be strong, because this is one of those rising tide lifts all ships ideas, that the more countries that have a stable currency, the more we will be able to do international trade, the more we will be able to trade internationally ideas that will help advance humanity, and the more we will be able to deal with problems like people dying because they don't have enough to eat or because they're eating too much, or target focus on issues such as racism or on the global problems of human rights around the world. And we need to focus on these. And the first way we do that is we fix our own economies. And once our economies are fixed, then we can turn our attention to that. Now, international business is a core of business. It's not the only core. There's several cores in business, and this is one of the cores that is vital as humanity evolves and starts looking at near-stellar travel. If we do not stabilize international business, it's going to be difficult to manage near space and further out business. And this is one of the reasons why we should be having an international association of businesses as opposed to an international association of governments. Because as we step beyond the bounds of Earth, the nation state becomes less important in the interstellar travel than the actual businesses that are going to be trading in that. So I do want to invite you guys all to go to www.brab.org, which will allow you a chance to check out the Brave platform and learn a little bit about how we are trying to help people have access to justice, access to information, and the ability to settle their cases without going to a court whenever you can actually, it's something you can settle at home. I would also like to let everybody know that if you email info@brave.org, so info@brab.org, you can get some information on the destination events we're setting up. As soon as the corona lockdown lifts and we aren't going to be restricted to one country at a time, we are going to be taking groups to other countries to have edu vacations where you're going to get to learn, get certified in different skill sets, and go to another nation and get to see some culture, because we do truly believe that whenever you're outside of your comfort zone, you learn more than whenever you're inside your comfort zone. So we are hoping that when you're watching this and when you're watching the other speakers at this conference, that you'll help us build a brave world through interactions, through networking, and through understanding that regardless of what country we are in, regardless of what skin color we have, regardless of who we are, if we are good people, we can work together and make the world a better place. So please check out my paper whenever it comes out in a couple months at the Perner Foundation in blog or in the journal. It's called Lawful Talks. And thank you very much for coming and listening to this speech. And I would like to thank any of you that came. And if you have any questions, please email me. My email is on the website. Thank you very much, and please have a wonderful day.